Okay, so we're going to be discussing photosynthesis today. So photosynthesis is a form of autotrophic nutrition, which just basically means this organism is making their own food. And by food, we really mean sugar. So the food essentially that's being made is carbohydrates. And if you just break down the term carbohydrate, you're going to notice that the carbo is really referring to that main atom or element in organic molecules, carbon. And when we talk about hydration or hydrating, we're really talking about water, right? So a carbohydrate is basically a hydrated carbon, or AKA carbon from a carbon dioxide molecule with water added to it. So this might not make too much sense quite yet, but take a look at the formula for photosynthesis and autotrophic nutrition. So what's the formula? You're taking carbon dioxide and water, and with the energy from sunlight, as well as some assistance from enzymes, you're creating glucose and oxygen. So taking a look at this kind of more intensive formula, there's a lot going on here, but just breaking it down, CO2 and H2O will give you glucose, C6H12O6, and an oxygen molecule. Now that oxygen molecule is what's left over after you snatch away the C from CO2, hence carbohydrate, taking away the C, and you're left with an oxygen molecule, or O2. So where does this all happen? In these little green organelles. Here's a really cool picture from an electron microscope. These things are, hopefully you guessed it by now, chloroplasts. And a chloroplast has a few different components, none of this you have to know for a Regents class. You should make a note, though, that this green pigment is chlorophyll. We'll take a look at that in a bit. But in this diagram, nothing on the inside of this chloroplast is important. But what is essential that you know is that light with water and CO2, those are the components that go into this process. Those are the components, or the reactants, in this reaction. Those are going in. So again, make a note, they are going in. If you ever see a question with an arrow pointing into a chloroplasts, you're looking for reactants, which can be any one of these three. Light is kind of a weird one because it's photon / electromagnetic radiation. It's not really a molecule. You'll probably see it in the form of either water, H2O, or carbon dioxide, CO2. But again, the arrows are pointing in, hence it's one of these three. And you also have some products, arrows pointing out. Again, key point here, arrows pointing out. The products are oxygen, O2, and sugars, glucose, carbohydrates, complex carbs, eventually, like starch or something, cellulose. So anyway, you have these products and you have these reactants in this photosynthesis overview. So I'm not going to go too crazy. I just kind of want to point out some wild things that are happening here. So this is all happening in the membrane of a component inside of a chloroplast. Hopefully you've guessed what these green dots are. Those are chlorophyll. And these funny little wavy yellow laser thingies are light. And what's happening is they're making energetic molecules in the meantime. So here's a cool animation. Those weird blue laser beams are just specific wavelengths of light. It's just light. What you might notice here is there's these weird molecules called NADPH and ATP floating away. ATP, hopefully you remember, ATP is an energy molecule. That's like a readily available energy for a cell, as well as NADPH. So the only reasons those exist, or you're seeing them right now, is because they're actually kind of little intermediary energy molecules in the making of food. So here's the process. If you were taking AP biology, you'd have to know each component of this, but none of that's actually important. What is important is what's coming in and what's coming out. So CO2 is coming in, and you also have these energy molecules. If you remember, we were looking at those weird laser beams. And we take the energy, along with some hydrogen atoms from our intermediary energized molecules, are going to make, essentially, sugar. One more time, the intermediary steps, this whole cycle is not that important for Regents biology, but what is that you understand the reactants, what comes in, and the products, what comes out. So one more time, reactants. Things coming in, CO2, H2O, and light. Things coming out, oxygen, and sugar. Now, this process is finely regulated. You can imagine water is really important for this, but also so is gas exchange. So like, for example, I'm talking a lot right now. As people talk a lot, their mouths are open, a lot of gases are moving in and out. They tend to get dry mouths, and you don't want that happening in a leaf. So you have these kind of preventative measures that plants take to prevent excess water loss or just too much water loss. So in a leaf, carbon dioxide has to go in. Remember, that's the air that's pointing in. You need carbon dioxide for this. But also, water is going to leave through a process called transpiration. It's kind of like evaporation within the leaf. So water leaves, as does oxygen, which is kind of like a byproduct. Yes, plants do use oxygen, but they make a lot more than what they consume. So oxygen leaves too. So these little pores, these openings called stomata, allow for gases to come in and out. So they allow for gas exchange within photosynthesis, but also they increase transpiration. They're literally openings in a leaf. So water can easily leave through those openings. Here's another pretty cool high-res shot of stoma or stomata. So what we're looking at here is actually this is an oregano leaf, and trying to get into focus here. And as we zoom in, you're going to start to notice these small dots. And if we get a closer look, these are stoma that are found on the oregano leaf. How cool is that? And there's quite a few. There's many stoma or stomata. And the more stomata a plant has or a leaf has, generally it's a sign that the more gas exchange that's happening and the less worried it's about transpiration. So generally these plants are pretty well hydrated, and it's doing a lot of photosynthesis to have so many stomata. And if there are fewer stomata, that's probably a sign that it's under a lot more stress and it's not going through as intensive photosynthesis. So here's how this thing works. So what happens is these things called guard cells actually open and close depending on how hydrated a plant is. So it's a really cool way of exploiting osmosis. So if you guys remember, osmosis is the diffusion of water. So if a plant is well hydrated, the plant will have a lot of water in those vacuoles, and then it'll open, which makes sense because if you have a lot of water, you're not too worried about losing water. So these guard cells change shape due to osmosis. So they open when they're hydrated, and when they're dehydrated, they close, which prevents water loss. But also simultaneously, it'll also prevent the exchange of gases, which, as we know, is required for photosynthesis. So it's like this trade-off, but at the same time, it's how a plant is able to maintain homeostasis or a dynamic equilibrium. All right, so we hit a lot of points, but just the basics of what you need to know for the Regents all fits onto this one slide. So here's what's important. Photosynthesis. You're taking inorganic reactants like CO2 and H2O and energy from sunlight, inorganic energy, and transforming it into organic molecules and energy. So glucose, simple sugars, carbohydrates, all these things are organic molecules rich with organic energy. And you're also making oxygen. So the energy that is in glucose or those sugars or carbohydrates, that energy is stored within chemical bonds. The creation of these molecules is facilitated by enzymes. So enzymes are necessary for photosynthesis. Also, this process only occurs in chloroplasts. Again, only found in plant cells. For the sake of the Regents, they're only found in plant cells. And Stomata and guard cells on leaves can regulate water loss, so they regulate transpiration. So if a plant's losing too much water, these things can open and close to control water loss. So after you've taken a look at this, hopefully all this makes sense. If there's something in here that was new, I suggest taking down some notes, making a note of it somewhere, and let's do some practice problems. So Regents practice. Take a look, read it to yourself when you're ready, or hit pause, and then when you're ready, hit play. Which process usually uses carbon dioxide molecules? So, cellular respiration, asexual reproduction, active transport, or autotrophic nutrition? The answer is D. Remember, carbon dioxide is being used up by photosynthesis. That is another way of saying autotrophic nutrition. Which statement best describes a starch? A type of carbohydrate content of two leaves taken from the same plant, shown in the chart below. So leaf A has been in the dark for 48 hours, while leaf B has been is taken from a plant in bright light for 48 hours. Take a look at your choices, hit pause, and when you're ready, hit play. Okay, so taking a look at this, the only thing that makes any sense, neither leaf would contain starch. That's silly. Hopefully you know starch, again, is a carbohydrate. So carbohydrates are created from the process of photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is clearly happening in leaf B, since it's been getting energy from light. So leaf B will have carbohydrates. A is incorrect. B is incorrect because leaf A has been in the dark. In the dark, you're not going to have energy for photosynthesis. Chances are leaf A has a lot less carbohydrates, a lot less starch. C, leaf A contains more. We just explained how leaf A has less. D, leaf B contains more starch than leaf A, of course, because it's been in light for the past 48 hours. It's been undergoing photosynthesis. Answer is D. Next up, the diagram below represents a cell of a green plant. Solar energy is used to produce energy-rich compounds in structure what? So hit pause, think about it. When you're ready, hit play. So the answer here is going to be D. A, hopefully we identified as a nucleus. B is pointing to the inside line of this plant cell, and that's very important because that inner line is the cell membrane, which controls what is able to come in or out, diffuse in, has protein channels, pumps, does active transport. B is the cell membrane. C in this case is a large vacuole. It's not of heavy focus on the Regents, but you should be able to clearly identify it as one of those markers for a plant cell. It's a large vacuole. D here is a chloroplast. On the Regents, they show them as shaded in because, again, these organelles have pigments, they have a color, they're generally green. So on a black and white printout copy, they generally show these organelles as just filled in black. The answer for this question is D. They produce sugars or energy-rich compounds. Next one up. Which process uses energy to combine inorganic molecules to synthesize organic molecules? Take a look at your choices, hit pause. When you're ready, hit play. So you're taking inorganic molecules to synthesize organic molecules. That's photosynthesis. Inorganic molecules like water, H2O, they don't have a C and an H. They are inorganic. CO2, inorganic, does not have a C and an H. To be organic, you must have a carbon and a hydrogen atom. And neither of the reactants in photosynthesis have them. However, they do produce sugar or starch or carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is a category of organic molecules. The formula for sugar is C6H12O6, C6 being carbon, H12 being hydrogen. They have both carbon and hydrogen. C is your answer. Just so you know, A does the exact opposite. We'll cover that in another lesson. B, digestion, is not specific to organic or inorganic. Same as D, decomposition. Next question. The diagram below illustrates the movement of materials involved in a process that is vital for the energy needs of organisms. The process illustrated occurs within. So hit pause. When you're ready, hit play. So the answer here is A. We're looking at chloroplasts. Ribosomes produce proteins. They look very different. Mitochondria, that produces ATP for a cell, also very different. And vacuoles stores water generally, also very different looking. So the answer here are chloroplasts. This picture is a chloroplast. Next up. A small water plant, Elodia, was placed in bright sunlight for 5 hours as indicated below. Bubbles of oxygen gas were observed being released from the plant. So, what substance did the plant most likely absorb from the water in order to produce the oxygen gas? Okay. Look it over. When you're ready, hit pause, and when you're ready, hit play. All right. Looking at this plant is being exposed to sunlight, which means it's getting the energy to undergo photosynthesis. It's producing the bubbles. Those bubbles are most likely oxygen. Look, it's even labeled bubbles of oxygen gas. So if it's producing oxygen and it's being exposed to sunlight, it must be obvious at this point it's going through photosynthesis. Now, what has to be taken out of the water to do photosynthesis? Well, what are the reactants for photosynthesis? What are the arrows that go in? So we know there's energy, which is not one of the choices. Sunlight, again, not one of the choices. There's H2O, there's water, also not one of the choices. But plants for photosynthesis also use carbon dioxide. The answer is B. The reason it's not an enzyme is because the enzymes are synthesized within the plant cell. The plants make enzymes. They don't take it out of the water. Enzymes are they're proteins made with a very specific shape, a very specific amino acid sequence that's coded within the plant's DNA. So that's not a random molecule taken out of water. The molecule taken out of water is carbon dioxide. Next up. Same diagram. Take a look at the bubbles of oxygen. What does that indicate? It indicates that the plant is what? Hit pause, and when you're ready, hit play. So if the plant is going through photosynthesis, which again is pretty evident from the signs of oxygen gas being produced and the exposure to sunlight, which is a source of energy, it must be making sugar. Because again, sugar is the main product of photosynthesis. That is the food from autotrophic nutrition that's being produced. The answer is A. B, making protein. Protein probably is being made, but you don't produce oxygen gas in the process of making a protein. That's just a very strange thing to suggest. Releasing energy from water. Well, I mean, there is technically energy stored within water molecules, but not the kind of energy that's going to be used for life. Water is a universal solvent. That's why it's so important for life, but it's not important as an energy source. That is just ridiculous. And carrying on active transport, again, that's probably happening, but you don't make oxygen in the process of carrying on or doing active transport. You do make oxygen when you do photosynthesis. And when you're doing photosynthesis, you also make sugar. The answer is A. Last one. The diagram below represents a change in guard cells that open and close pores in a plant. So this change directly helps to what? Hit pause, and when you're ready, hit play. So the answer here is regulate water loss. Heterotrophic nutrition just literally means like eating. Pretty much animals that are heterotrophs only have mitochondria. So that is neither of these things. Absorbing minerals, B. That happens at the plant roots, also not really a main focus on living environment in the regions. D, reduce seed production. That's just a weird thing to suggest. Also not covered in the living environment regions. So these are all just distractions. The answer here is regulate water loss. So I hope you guys did okay. These are all Regents questions. They've been on tests before. You might see them on your tests in class. I wish you all good luck and see you next time.